today we are talking about economics and the financial markets and Vedic astrology related to that. So the first question that I think most people are interested in is the crypto world, because cryptos are in the doldrums since basically beginning of this year. And can you see any improvement in that?
Yeah, so the cryptos, we expected them to do a lot better than they've been doing. But right now, this month, I'm actually looking at the movement of the planets. And essentially, it won't do well. I mean, especially this month, all the way down to, let's say, most of the month of August, and it won't do well. So we're looking at the cryptos, and also the stock market, the financial markets will generally not do well in August. But starting early September is when things will start moving up. Now, interestingly, the way I see this is that September, October, November, December, and January will be like the rise, the large rise that we've seen, probably similar to what happened last year, but not maybe all the way to 20,000. I don't know whether that will actually reach that high or surpass it. It's just that we're going to see the cryptos and even some of the financial markets doing really well starting from September onwards. However, with the cryptocurrencies particularly, I think by the end of January and early February is when it will start tapering down again. So my advice would be to buy and maybe sell around middle January to end of January. So and it will go down for the winter period, and then might come back up again in the spring.
Okay, winter period.
Yeah.
Sorry, winter period means after January, basically.
After January, yeah. So January, February, March, that whole period is going to be a bit tough for financial markets, and even cryptocurrencies particularly, because I think what people will do is that they'll try to cash in the cryptos towards January, February, which actually is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it has been going on, especially with Bitcoin, since many years. No, I think except 1 year, there was always a big downturn in January, basically for tax reasons, maybe also.
Right.
And so people were cashing out in December and beginning of January. A lot of people I hear say that the next downturn or the next correction should be much shorter. Do you see something like that? Or did you look so far ahead?
I didn't see the correction for next year. I was just looking at this year and to see what's going on. But then, we can talk more about it probably in January or December.
Okay.
So we'll figure it out.
Yeah, sounds good to me, and makes sense somehow if I compare it to other predictions. So there's no contradiction for me in here. One major thing that has been going on at cryptos and the stock markets were kind of in sync until, I mean, there still are basically. The question is if you see anything happening regarding this, if you see something that the crypto markets or blockchain technology is at one point getting out of sync with the stock market. So for instance, the stock market falls and the crypto markets rise. Or do you see something that there is a slow, kind of a more hidden bleed over from money from the traditional markets into crypto markets without it being very visible?
That's a very good question, actually. The way I've been looking at this, especially during the last couple of years, as I've been analyzing the financial markets and cryptos, I find that they actually go together, astrologically speaking. So this is purely from astrology, that the indicators that I use to predict or to look at the movements of cryptos or the stock market is essentially the same. However, there are some other factors that actually gives the cryptos a different nuances, astrologically speaking. So those changes, those factors will not change. I don't see it as separate. I don't think it's going to be separate, at least for the next 20, 30 years. However, um, in about maybe 3 to 4 years, cryptos will become mainstream.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to some degree, I think. I mean, if you entertain the idea that cryptos are steered by the same powers, and they orchestrate the kind of transfer from the old economy, especially the whole
Right.
debt bubble that exists, into something that can be verified on the blockchain.
Yeah.
So that from kind of
Yeah.
supports this idea. So cryptos is not the rogue element here then.
Yeah. No, the thing is that you find that the established financial markets will try to destroy it. And so you'll find like, the IMF or the banks, the traditional mode of financial structures, they will try to hold on to it. However, the movement on the other side of, let's say, countries like in Brazil or in the developing countries in Africa, in Asia, they need the cryptocurrencies because their financial banks and the central banks don't function very well as do banks in the Western world. So because there'll be a demand-driven need for cryptos currency around the world, that will come back. It's the big conflict between the established banks and the tax institutions trying to establish their foothold. And once they can figure out a way to tax the transactions, financial transactions, then I'm sure it will become part of the mainstream economy. But it will be forced to. There's no way out. So let's look at about maybe 3 to 4 years, and astrologically speaking, it will really take off by then. In about 8 to 10 years, there's actually a major event that's going to start playing out, which pretty much has to do with a war or wars. And that will actually really, again, bring the cryptos up into place. So cryptos are here to stay, of course. The question becomes which cryptos are valid, which ones are not. So a lot of the cryptos will die, and then we'll find some that are going to be mainstream. I mean, that's exactly what happened with, for instance, the cell phone companies. And there's after a period of time, there is a sort of a stabilization of
course, of the new technology, basically.
Yeah.
So after 8 to 9 years, that would be basically, you think there's another boost or a new boom coming for cryptos, or it's a new level of establishment, or?
Yeah, and that will be triggered by wars. Now, I haven't quite figured out exactly when those wars are going to start taking place, but it will be between 8 or 9 years. I have to do more research on it, but since it's far away down the road, I don't try to waste a lot of time trying to look at what's going to happen, 5 years from now. I try to focus on what's happening in the next year or two, because what happens 5 or 10 years from now depends a lot on what's happening within that close proximity. So it becomes a bit redundant to make predictions 5 years down the road. But what is guaranteed is the fact that there's going to be a war, a large scale war.
Okay.
And once those wars kick in, then again, people will start shifting monies into cryptocurrencies or things like that. At that time, also the cryptos will also reach a certain maturity level that people will have more confidence in the cryptocurrencies, and even the financial industries will start using cryptos more because of its sophistication and maturity at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, because usually big wars were usually the tool how the elites tried to change the global system and financial system also. So we could see the shift in World War I. We could see the shift from the gold standard or metal-based currencies to paper-based currencies on a large scale or on a global scale. And so that makes sense to some degree if we talk about blockchain in a currency perspective.
Yeah.
Another thing that would interest me is if you say the global traditional markets and the crypto markets go in sync, what indicators do you use or astrologically?
So
Or
astrologically, I mean, I don't want to reveal my secrets,
yeah,
basically.
but I mean, are you using,
But
for instance, the chart of Bitcoin for the cryptos as past
no,
or
no. Basically, I use the global movement of the planets because it affects everybody.
yeah.
So, for instance, when I look at the financial movements, like I said, for instance, from September, I didn't say this specifically earlier, I said early September because it never quite works on a specific date. But starting from September 2nd of this year is when we see a huge, when we see the financial markets start improving. So it should be like around 1st or 2nd, 3rd of September of this year where the financial instrument starts working. Now, this I look as a global scale on where the planets are, and it affects everybody
Yeah,
around the world. Now, when we look at
that's nice.
making predictions for specific cryptos or blockchain, then we have to look at the date of creation or the date of when it was first traded in order to determine how well that particular currency will do over a period of time.
Yeah. So, but if you say something like cryptos will change somehow course after this great war, do you? I mean, you have some indicator basically that denominates cryptos, or you? Yeah.
Yeah, so you see, cryptos are a new thing, right? We know that, right? So what was the new factor that came in the last few years? So we saw that from 2008, there was a new shift in the planetary movement that makes it really significant in how it all moved on to where it is today. Now, interestingly enough, that although it started in 2009, it really didn't pick up until last year because of that huge rise, you know. And so it's also interesting to see how, astrologically speaking, what influences that actually triggered this movement, you know. So yes, I look at it from a global perspective. Now, of course, even when we look at the individual cryptocurrencies, we have to look at it in terms of where its location is, and then also within the environment of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if a coin is issued in the US and the US economy is not doing so well, then that coin will obviously be affected because of the location. Now, that is inherent in the fundamental structure of looking at individual coins. You know, so there is the general, what we call the general movements of the financial markets in the world, and then there is the specific markets that we deal with on a regular basis. So that's what we kind of do.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm getting that, but I don't, of course, don't want to pick your astrological secrets or details, but would that mean basically that you identified some sort of new astrological factor on a global level that came into place in 2008, 2009, that you can basically use as a tag or marker for the new economy or the new blockchain?
Absolutely, yeah. So what happens is you see a downturn, you also see a rise. So there was a downturn, that big economic crash that we had in 2008. You could see that astrologically. In fact, I had predicted that months before, and maybe even a year before that, 2008. In fact, to the date, I have an email that I sent to some friends that was the day when there was going to be an economic crash.
Yeah.
And so my friends were a little impressed that I could predict something like that. But what I've been doing is I've been kind of studying the movements of the financial markets based on astrology, because this is something I've been interested in. And there was a new feature, a new shift. It's not like, there was a new asteroid or a new planet that came by. It's just that the movements of planets shifted, particularly last year, which was very indicative of the rise of cryptos that we saw last year.
Okay,
And
so basically you have an indicator that you can use on a global scale without going into the specific date of birth and location of certain cryptos or the leading cryptos or something like that.
that's right. No, for global scale, I don't use leading cryptos.
Yeah.
On a global scale, I just look at the financial markets, and that has seemed to work really well because I've been using it for the stock market, and I've been doing relatively well on the big scale.
Yeah.
On the small scale, I still have to do more research, and the more I dabble in it, the more I learn.
Yeah, I mean, since maybe I inject something here that since we're not giving financial advice here, but we're looking at it from a philosophical perspective, so we're mostly interested in the big scale and not into detailed prices or anything like that. Just as a short disclaimer. Another major question I think that would be interesting on the big scale again is if we see Bitcoin or the cryptocurrency markets as a human being, or as like a being that has a birth and a death and a life in between. At which stage would this cryptocurrency blockchain technology be now? Would it be like in primary school, or would it be a toddler or a teenager, or at which stage roughly?
We are really in KG, in kindergarten. We have not evolved. It will take a few more years to evolve. It's if you look at the way the currencies came into the paper currencies came into existence, it started actually in the late 1800s, and really the banks in New York would issue paper as a tender for the gold that was deposited in the bank, right? So today we never think about gold, and you see the shift from the paper, from gold to paper. Then before that, there were some other metals like silver, silver coins, gold coins, which was used for the most part in the medieval times. So if you really study the history of money, you see that we as we evolve, as technology evolves, then even the instruments that we use for financial transactions change. Today, we don't carry paper money as much. We just have these numbers, and we use plastic cards, and so the transition into cryptos is very easy. It will really come into play. It will become mainstream if and only way there is a way that the cryptocurrencies find a way to pay taxes. If the governments find a way that they can actually pay taxes, and the government themselves have the intelligence or have the software to actually tax people on each transaction based on cryptocurrencies, then it will become mainstream. But right now we're in kindergarten, so we're still playing with different things, and the war that will come in, it will take us through that teenage phase. Like typical with teenagers, there's the rebelliousness, there's the thing about finding individuality and trying to explore. So the war will actually shift the way we look at cryptocurrency.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. So I mean, it's also good to, I'm not sure if it's good, but it's definitely taking place now that still a lot of people believe that this is a grassroots movement and not in any way steered by the old powers that are or be.
Right.
I don't think it's really a grassroots movement in that sense, except for individual cryptos. But in the greater thing, I believe that it's like a controlled social experiment, or not experiment, it's a social plan that's executed here. But that's a philosophical point anyways.
If you look at where cryptos are today, since I've been in the computer industry for a long time, it's pretty much where the computer industry was in the early 80s or mid 80s, when the laptops would come out, and people were thinking this was kind of dumb because they're just toys, really. And so Steve Jobs, when he came up with his little Apple computer, it was like a toy. Only kids and young teenagers would buy it. It was not used for office work. And I remember that. And there's some other computers like Atari. So when you look at that, today we cannot do anything without our laptops. let alone a mainframe. And when you talk about mainframe, it's like that's like a dinosaur. So there was an evolution there of technology. Today we have the power that was in a mainframe is in our palm. We have it in a smartphone. So that technology moves very rapidly. Every year it changes. So I don't see. I think based on astrology and based on technology, I don't see cryptos going away. It's a way of life. It's going to be more prevalent in our daily lives as soon as we start maturing. Like I said, we're in kindergarten, so we just have to wait till we get into that teenage phase and then grow from there.
Yeah, and even in kindergarten you have dropouts already.
Exactly. Yeah.
Who kind of disappear. At least a lot of cryptos will disappear.
Exactly.
Yes, I'm not sure how much time we still have left, but maybe we can, since this is about economics in general, one thing that I would be interested in is also that's relevant for a lot of people is the real estate market. Do you have any markers, or did you observe anything about global real estate, for instance? It seems that to be turning around in the US and Canada at least. Or is that the field that you're not really?
I did look at that. My early indications that next year it will go down rather than up. I think we've peaked right now. We've peaked, and so it might go down, but I haven't done a lot of research on real estate because it's not something I've been keeping up with. But we can do another talk on real estate. I've been able to actually look at that for the most part and look at it particularly in the US and Europe. So
because it seems the market is somehow fracturing, and it's peaking, and parts of it are peaking, and some parts are really taking off. So it looks like prices are exploding in some segments, but at the same time the volume dies down. So it's kind of a very awkward situation.
So this year we're sort of reaching the peak, and I think next year and the following years there'll be some correction. So I've been kind of holding off on to looking at real estate because I feel that next year it will go down. So this is a really good time to sell if you're trying to sell. If you're trying to buy, I would wait.
That's obvious, because it moves also usually in a very slow rhythms. I mean, on a larger scale, but and everything. Anyways, one thing that I want to mention to people who comment on these videos is that Swamiji can, of course, analyze certain tokens and coins, but we would be very happy if you could do some work, you as a viewer, and come up with the research regarding the genesis block of the specific coin you're interested in. So that basically the birth time of the coin, that in most cases will be the genesis block, and also the location of the company and the location probably of the server where the first block was mined. So if somebody is really interested in getting an analysis of a certain crypto, it would be good to send an email to Swami or me, or comment with these details. And you really need to do the proper research because we don't have the time to do that. Otherwise, an astrological chart cannot be made for a crypto.
So basically what I'm looking at is when was the coin issued, or when, that's one, and where. And the second thing is when was it first traded? And now that becomes we fall into a gray area because sometimes they offer it, within a small groups, and then. But what I'm looking at is when was it publicly traded? Is if we can get those two dates and the location of where it was traded, then it's something I can work with in terms of looking at the future trends of that particular coin.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Anyways. And we will do another video tomorrow about earth changes. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to get updates to all the videos. I think it will be quite relevant. Another point that maybe we can have some updates is you predicted a lot of rioting in 2018. I think we did some
Right.
videos in December or so, or in the beginning of this year, and that's definitely happening all over the world. So there's, I think people can look it up themselves, so they remember.
Yeah, if you watch the news, I mean, everywhere there's riots. France, Bangladesh. There's a lot of riots in Kerala, in South India last year. I mean, early this year. There's riots in Portland, USA. So yeah, everywhere you go, there's more riots than usual. There's people getting together, groups getting together. You see these marches that we saw, people coming up for, for every cause that you can think of. There's some group actually marching for it, which is quite unusual because that hasn't happened before. So the social causes or political causes, or people are just trying to get together and shift. I think that's a good trend.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the destruction that happens is probably not so good, but.
I mean, it feels a bit like the 1930s. When I was in Austria the last time, I really, also during the last presidential elections in Austria, I really had got the feeling that this is the 1930s again, and you have this splitting of fractions, and people are trying to get into this party or in that party, people who were completely apolitical before, and suddenly they feel compelled to join one or other clubs and have a very strong opinion on something.
Right.
So that's usually not a very good sign for me, but because people stop thinking, and if you continue this development, I can imagine that there will be another large war in 8 years, as you said, or 10 years. But do you see anything like on a social level for the next year or the next months that sticks out, like on a social side, like revolutions or local wars or something like that?
No, in terms of this year and next year, it's just again, it's really at that early stage of social coagulation. The precipitations that take place is just like on a very, very early stages, just like KG again. People need to learn how to organize themselves into a movement. So you see again that maturity will take place in the next couple of years, but this year and next year are essentially where the rioting will continue, or the groups will start formalizing into more organized and more effective rioting than just walking down the street with banners and screaming. That has some value, but it really is not very effective on the long term. So they're starting that way, but that will evolve into something more structured, more funding, more organized. And then you will find that will then precipitate into sort of like social and political organizations, and then that will evolve into something more sort of structured way of fighting than just walking down the street with protesting with banners and things like that. So. But in terms of revolutions, I don't see a lot of changes this year or next year.
And I mean, coming back to this big war, I think a lot of people see this coming, and in general, the blocks are already forming for that. So you basically see something like a world war, or another person I listened to said that it could be a war that basically takes place everywhere, like a global civil war that rages in individual countries, but it's not like one main fraction against the other main fraction. Can you make any predictions how this will play out, or what's the main?
I'm not quite. I know that it will affect. It will affect it globally. So to say that it's just going to be between two countries or one or two countries, that's not what I'm saying. The major war is that I suspect right now, and I probably need to do more research. I can give you more dates and research when we actually talk about it in the future. But there is a potential that it might start out in the Balkans and then spread out into the global scale. So a lot of countries will be affected by it. We don't know exactly how. but I wouldn't say that there will be two major powers that are fighting like the way we saw in the first two world wars. But it will be that people, there will be a shift, and I'm not sure exactly how that will play out, but it's not going to be between two major powers.
Yeah.
I think if I suspect anything, it might have to do with religious structures rather than political structures.
Mm-hmm. But religious structures, I mean, it makes a lot of sense now. And if you know the old letters between Mazzini and what was the other, Albert Pike,
Right.
I mean, that has been coming down the pipe since a long time, and so far it plays out very well. So the next, according to these letters, which is of course utter conspiracy theory and cannot be true in any sense, it would basically mean the destruction of Islam and Judaism. So that would be the main fractions or Islam and Judeo-Christianity. I mean, something like sounds very obvious to us today, but in the 1920s or late 19th century, that would not have been an obvious prediction to make for this time here.
Yeah.
Do you see something along these lines, basically that it's another religious war between?
It could be something like that. It's basically people will be looking at reforming how they relate to God or how they relate to spirituality, and the traditional and the old structures that we have, the religious structures, will be actually will have to reform, or will be torn down.
Will they survive these old structures?
It doesn't seem like it, but this is not based on astrology. This is just based on my hypothetical views, in the sense that I don't see that these structures surviving, because the younger generation, they are born with a greater awareness than the parents have, so they will be actually the drivers of how they relate to how they relate to the consciousness, or how they relate to God, or what God means to them, and and what religion means to them, and all that.
So. Speaking of God, do you see any involvement or recurrence of the ancient gods? I mean, that they basically take the stage again, or do you see something coming like that? I mean, that's another thing that has been discussed in the West a lot in conspiracy circles, that basically you have these ancient gods as physical beings again entering the scene and taking over, which of course has close links also to the system of monarchy again, because monarchs were thought as the kind of caretakers of these gods.
I don't see a repetition of old structures. There will be some resemblance, but not quite the same. One of the key things is that based on the Vedic theory of the yugas, we are seeing a rise that the Kali Yuga, or the age of darkness, has come to an end. So we're just at the beginning of the transformation into the light, and that means we'll be going towards the positive direction of finding out what the truth is. So a lot of people will start looking and asking questions: is what does exist, and what does it mean? Do you believe in something that doesn't exist? Like, do you believe in heaven, and does it really exist? Or do you believe God is sitting up in heaven judging you? I mean, these kinds of thinking will actually disappear. But then they will say, okay, well, there is the cosmic universal force, and how do we relate to that? And so people will be asking more authentic questions, more deeper questions, to understand what that all means and how we relate to it. So there will be a rise of that rather than just blind belief.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it would be a huge topic on its own again.
Exactly.
The whole thing, but it touches a bit the political and spectrum. So you don't see a kind of a reestablishment of monarchy or something like that because of this.
Yeah,
I mean,
there will be better structures, but not based on monarchy. There will be similar structures because democracy really, if you look at democracy the way it is today, it doesn't work. When certain people have certain powers, then they tend to corrupt the power. So what you'll find is that there will be a hybrid of democracy and monarchy.
Monarchy in the sense of the ancient regime, that basically you have the same players, or I mean, personally, I don't think that monarchy is really something that in Europe has an ancient history. I mean, it's rather recent, in my opinion. But
no, what happens is, and this is really like you said, it's a whole different topic. We'll find that the future leaders will be trained right from the time they're born, because then they're meant to be great leaders. So right now you find that, for instance, in the US, people get to power and they have absolutely no experience about leadership. I mean, they have a few things here, they write a book, and it's based on popularity contest. And running a great country with all the powers it has requires tremendous experience, not because somebody's popular, and this is one of the flaws of democracy, really.
I mean, that was also the I think that was also the case more in a republic of like Plato envisioned it. I mean, basically they had a society with slaves back then. Now we have a society with machine slaves. But the point was in Rome and Greece that you could only lead a country if you were basically trained from young on, and you were a free citizen and did not need to work for an income and for a living, because then you wouldn't have time to deal with all these issues and politics. So that makes sense to some degree. The question is, will be this selection of the right people to be trained, will this be based on a spiritual analysis of people? Could you imagine something like this?
It will be based on experience and spiritual evolution. So I mean, this is what I foresee. The more advanced structures, because again, coming from an astrological point of view, is that if we can predict Trump is going to win, or if we can predict which president is going to win, then to what extent does all these other structures mean? I mean, is it really democratic to say that Trump won when we can predict he won? So it was fated. So whatever means you use to bring a person to that position, we have to find a more effective means rather than some of these broken systems. So I think we're going to evolve into a mindset where we just do not incorporate the day-to-day crude ways of doing things, but we'll incorporate spirituality. We're going to incorporate the things like astrology, for instance, to see whether this person is meant to do this and what kind of training this person would need. So I think there'll be a really good way of doing things much later from now. But that would be like 20, 30 years from now. We really have to grow to be able to come to that point.
Doesn't sound like being around the corner. Yeah, it's quite an interesting idea and concept, and I think we probably have to do at least one other video on this idea. Maybe not so much connected to astrology, but I think it's a very interesting topic that somehow we got into now.
I know.